Hi, this is ROSTOCK, or probably more correctly to how it's pronounced in the native tongue, ROSTOCK. ROSTOCK is a binary data pipeline, it says so on the front panel, but you can really just look at this as, well, digital binary delay with 46 steps. These 46 steps or stages of delay are provided by 46 delay cells. It's somewhat akin to a BBD delay, where the information is stored in these different stages and then passed along. And the length of each of these stages, and by this I mean the amount of time that each of these cells store the actual data, is determined by a clock. And usually this is a very high clock rate. And as usual, the clock provided by the Leibniz system, because you cannot use ROSTOCK independently, you need to provide it with some kind of input module and a clock source. So usually this clock is very high, usually it's 2 megahertz. And since this module is always in line with everything else, and by this I mean there's no built-in aux send, if you think of this merely as a delay. So it's always in line, so even at the fastest setting there's always going to be some kind of delay. But with a clock of 2 megahertz, this delay is so very small that it's, well, really unnoticeable. So this clock rate determines the length of each of these delay stages, and there's a maximum of 64 of them in ROSTOCK. And you can turn the amount of stages that are being used down to 1. And at this point, with a clock of 2 megahertz and just 1 delay stage used, I think it's in the manual, the delay is somewhere around 0.5 microseconds. So I saw some concerns about this on the ModWiggler page about ROSTOCK, how you never can turn off the delay once it's in line with everything else. Well, it's quite a challenge to actually hear a delay of 0.5 microseconds. So as I said, there's 46 available stages in ROSTOCK. You can turn them down to 1 stage or anything in between, of course, with this knob here. And this, of course, in tandem with the clock speed, determines the length of the delay. So usually these delays will be very short, at least when you use a high sample rate. Now the unique thing about this kind of delay setup, and well, for some people it might be a downside, is that the clock speed that you use also determines the sample rate of the audio that's going through. And I say audio, but you can send CV through ROSTOCK as well. So just like with a BBD delay, you can get longer delays with a much slower clock rate. Well, it's similar in ROSTOCK. But instead of a high-pitched whine that you usually get when you turn down the clock rate in a BBD, with ROSTOCK the sample rate just goes down a lot. But first, before I go any further with this video, I want to thank the people at Xaoc Devices for sending me another one of these interesting LEIBNIZ subsystem modules. They sent me Gera as well, which I will do a video about at some point. I received this module, what is it, like 6 months ago in July. And I would have started making the video in August, but well, then I found a new place to live. And for anyone that's been following me a little bit closer, you probably know how important getting out of that old place was. So instead of making a video, I had to pack up all my stuff, get the new place up and ready, and move everything over there. So here I am. So thank you Xaoc Devices, and apologies for the huge delay. In this video I will, well, first of all start off by explaining you how I made the patch in the intro and how ROSTOCK is being used in that patch. I'll show you how the controls work and how you can control them with CV. And then I will just run you through the patch examples that are written down in a lot of detail in the manual. I think these are really great starting points for figuring out how you can use ROSTOCK in your system. And I cannot imagine that I am the only one that I'm really confused when I read some of those patch ideas. So I thought it would be a good idea to just explore them together and try to make something musical out of it. So first of all, I want to explain how this patch is made. Let me zoom out a bit for a moment so you can see a bit more of what's going on. So I'm using an output of Odessa, and Odessa is being modulated. I'm using an output of Odessa. It's going through a VCA. I'm using maths as an envelope for this VCA. I'm running the output of this VCA into a filter here. You can barely see it here. Let me turn down the resonance, and well, let's turn up the frequency completely so the signal goes through almost unaltered. The output of all of this is melted. One signal is going through data, but into Dresna and through ROSTOCK. The thing that I'm sending into Dresno and ROSTOCK is the upper trace here. I know you can't see it very well, but it's really not that important. And the red trace is the thing that's coming out of Dresno. So that's the signal that's being processed by ROSTOCK. I'm running another one of these melted signals into causalin. So this is what you could consider my dry signal, a signal that's not going through the Leibniz subsystem. Let me mute this part of the signal for a moment. So this is Odessa going through a VCA and envelope combo through a filter, but I'm not using it as a filter at the moment. And then the output is going through Kotzalin, and well, I'm having a lot of fun with Kotzalin. It's kind of a mono to stereo processor. I mean, you can turn up the frequency on Kotzalin, but when you keep it down, I really think it's, well, it's lovely sounding as a stereo, well, mono to stereo processor. Let's, but I want to kind of bypass Kotzalin, so it's more mono again, and when I bring in this part of the signal again, you can hear how this sounds very, well, sample rate reduced. And this is because I'm sending in my own clock right now. The clock is just a VCO. I'm using a square output of 3 body, but you can use anything you want. The reason I'm doing this is because, well, I'm guessing most people will be interested, first of all, in the delay capacities of ROSTOCK. And the only way to get any kind of noticeable delay really is by using your own clock. So let's change the envelopes for Odessa a bit. Let's zoom out on the scope. Let's change this. So I think you can make out the image on the scope just enough to be able to notice how much delay we are getting. Well, you're hearing it as well, of course. So let's turn this audio rate VCO all the way up. When I mute the original signal, so we're just listening to the Leibniz output, I think you can hear with an audio rate VCO at maximum, which is, well, on 3 body, probably something around 20 kilohertz, maybe a little bit higher, I'm not exactly sure. But you can clearly hear that the audio is clean enough. But then, well, we're not getting a lot of delay, are we? So it's always a choice between getting some delay and not destroying our signal. So I'm turning down the rate of the audio rate VCO that I'm using as the clock source for Dresno. So I think you'll agree that from the moment we get a perceivable delay, the audio is already very much destroyed. And this is with the length or the amount of stages set at the maximum amount or maximum value. When you turn this down, even with a slow clock rate, we'll barely get any kind of delay. You can of course send in clock signals that are way slower. For example, a clock that follows the tempo of your sequence. And then you can do all kinds of interesting stuff, like using ROSTOCK as a Turing machine, but we will get into that kind of stuff later. So let's turn up my audio rate VCO used as a clock here. Let's turn up the amount of stages. Let's go to 32, because I want to show you how you can use CV to change the amount of stages being used. By this point I can just as well zoom in again, because we're not getting any useful information from the scope. So you can modulate the amount, the value of the stages, the amount of stages with CV. Right now I'm sending in a 10 volt peak-to-peak signal, which means the signal lives between 5 volts and minus 5 volts. And as you can see, we're not going all the way. We're not reaching 0, we're not reaching 46. And this is because we can attenuate the influence of any external CV on the length. And to do this, you press this button. And then you can see here that we are at 5.0, which means we're about halfway the attenuation. If we just want to use our full 10 volt peak-to-peak signal, we set this to the maximum, which is 9.9. And now you can see that the same signal has a much bigger reach. Now if I turn up the rate of this signal, and let me now mute the original sound source. So we're once again just listening to the Leibniz output. Now, besides getting some glitches, which it's explained in the manual why they are there, has something to do with how these different stages are selected and addressed. So if we ignore these glitches, which are normal, you can hear some kind of tremolo, vibrato. And this is of course because we're modulating the length of our delay, which at higher speeds sounds like we're doing some kind of pitch vibrato. Now, if you want this effect but you do not want the glitches, let's turn this back up to 46. It's probably a better idea to just modulate the signal that you're using as a clock source. So let's just do that. Let me zoom out again here. Well, let's just use this one. So now we're getting the same effect, but without the glitches, and this is because we are modulating the speed of our clock that is used to set the length of each of these stages, which also results in this kind of pitch vibrato, but without the glitches. And if we now bring in the original signal again, let's just take Kotzalin. I don't know how to pronounce this. If I reroute my signals here, so the Leibniz output is coming into our right ear, and the original signal, which is unprocessed by the Leibniz signal, is coming into our left ear, or speakers if you're listening on regular speakers. You can hear how we get a kind of phaser or maybe chorus effect by slowly modulating the length of our delay. And well, right now the length is not determined by the amount of stages, but merely by the clock source. Of course, then you need two external signals, one audio rate signal for the clock and one slower rate signal to modulate that clock. But if you have two of these signals that you can spare in your system, and you spend a little bit of time fine-tuning everything, you can get this interesting stereo situation. Well, of course, you need to patch these outputs up in stereo. If you just send them to a centered mono input, you won't get any stereo, of course. The important thing here is that we're getting slight timing shifts between the left signal and the right signal, which is really psychoacoustic in nature. This is how choruses and phasers and stuff like that are made. By the way, if you have no idea how any of this works, and by this I mean the Leibniz system, let me quickly explain, but it's probably better that if you don't have any idea about, for example, what Dresno does, that you just watch the video I did about Dresno. This is the first video that I did in this series. Well, there's a prequel video explaining how binary numbers work, but if you already know that, just jump straight to the video about Dresno. And I think the most detailed explanation about how Dresno converts audio or analog signals into binary numbers and how it converts them back into an analog signal and how this makes sense for all the other modules, well, I think the best explanation about all of that is in the video about Dresno. But there's a video about LIPSK, which helps to invert certain bits. That can be very interesting. There's a video about Jena, etc. There's a video about all the Leibniz modules so far, except ROSTOCK, but well, I'm working on this now, and Ikera. But in short, Dresno converts analog signals into binary numbers. Usually they also tell you how many bits are used, like 16-bit or 32-bit. Well, Dresno uses 8 bits, and 8 bits are together called a byte. And these bytes of 8 bits, which are just represented as binary numbers, each of these numbers represents the state of one of these bits. They can be either on or off, represented by a 1 or a 0. And these numbers can be, well, converted into analog signals again. So we can get an analog signal out of Dresno. Now on the back of Dresno there's a few connectors, and you can route the binary conversion of whatever you send in through a whole range of other modules before sending it back into this side of Dresno. And this side then converts the mangled binary signal. It converts it back into an analog signal, so we can actually use it as a modulation source or just listen to it. Now, I've been talking about ROSTOCK having 46 stages of delay, or 46 delay cells, but it actually has 46 stages for every bit. And normally all these stages for all of these 8 bits work at the same speed determined by the clock that we are sending into ROSTOCK. And by the way, you cannot send a global clock directly into ROSTOCK. You need to go through the LEIBNIZ bus, which is the connection on the back. And you need to use something like Dresno or POCZDAM to get that clock into ROSTOCK. But there's 8 individual clock inputs. So if you want, you can use different clock rates, so different speeds for every one of these bits. And I think you can imagine if you send in a clean sine wave, Dresno converts this into a nice binary number representing that sine wave. Then you run it through ROSTOCK as a delay and you extract the signal from Dresno again. You get a nice 8-bit version of that sine wave, but you shouldn't hear much of a difference, at least not when you're using a fast clock or just a built-in clock. But if you then start sending in signals here, and this again, you can send in audio rate oscillators here, or even just a trigger coming from your sequencer. Once you start doing that, the binary number will change, of course, and well, the output of Dresno won't be that clean sine wave anymore. And to demonstrate this behavior a little bit, I made this animation. I don't know if it's useful, but I've spent way too much time making this, so I want to use it anyway. So I think everyone, well, at least people my age, probably played with these kinds of building blocks. So if we consider the input stage of this machine here, being the ADC input of Dresno, so where you send in your signal, you can look at ROSTOCK as these 4 conveyor belts. There should be 8, but I just made 4. So usually these separate bits are being transported on the conveyor belts at the same speed. And then they reach the end of the conveyor belts and they magically get reassembled into, well, the same building that we started off with. Now, sometimes there's a mischievous person at the factory who sets different speeds for the different conveyor belts. And you can see that, well, the regular speed is 60. I think that's like about 60 buildings a minute that this machine spits out. But someone slowed 2 of the conveyor belts down to a speed of 30 parts an hour, and one even to 20 parts an hour. So they are going a lot slower than the other 2 conveyor belts. And of course what happens then is, well, the pieces don't arrive at the right time Well, and then the worker at the end of all of this has to make something of it, and the building he ends up with is something like this. And I really don't know if these kinds of building blocks are still being sold, but if you or your children receive this funky house, you know how that happened. So I hope by using this analogy you can imagine how you can split up the speeds for the different bits, and how when you just delay these at different clock speeds, even though you use the same amount of stages, you get something else than you sent in. Let's have a quick word about the loop and scramble features of ROSTOCK. Right now I'm running a sine wave coming from 3-body. I'm using the center VCO here. This sine wave is running through data. You can see it as the top, the green trace. This is routed through to the input on Dresno. The binary information is running through ROSTOCK, and then it's coming out of the DAC output of Dresno again. And this is the signal that we're monitoring here, the yellow trace, and it's also the signal that we are listening to. 3-body is a very unique digitalish complex oscillator. The black knobs are controls for the center VCO, and the silver ones are controls for 2 other VCOs. The reason I'm using 3-body is because it has a unique feature where you can set the outer VCOs to be a ratio of the frequency or the same frequency of the center VCO. You could say that there's built-in dividers and multipliers for the outer VCOs. Right now I'm using a square output of this left VCO as a clock source, but it's free running and it's set at the fastest frequency that it can go, the fastest rate, highest frequency. And this is similar to what we already saw. You'll see when I bring down the frequency here, you will see and hear sample rate reduction. So you can get these really interesting mechanical escalators here. Very cool. Now what I want to do is switch this VCO to being the same frequency as the signal that we are trying to analyze. So right now this is the case, but of course when the sample rate is the same frequency as the signal that you want to analyze, you're not getting anything out. Your clock or sample rate frequency has to be at least twice as high as the signal that you are trying to analyze. Right now we're at a sample rate that's twice the frequency of the signal that we're trying to analyze. This is also, by the way, why when you try to record something, for example at 84 kilohertz, you won't be recording any signals above 24 kilohertz. So if you really want to do ultrasonic recordings, you really need to up your sample rate. Otherwise you're not going to get any sounds. It's not enough to just increase your sample rate into ultrasonic. You really need to go twice as high. So let's just multiply this VCO more. And you can see what the different sample rates look like. But well, let's keep it somewhere around here. I'm not sure what this is. Maybe like this. This might be a divide by 8. I'm guessing it's something like that. So, until now, ROSTOCK isn't really doing that much. It's just delaying our signal. You can see it when I adjust the amount of stages, which is just adjusting the amount of delay. You get this phase shift between the signal that I'm getting out of Dresno and the signal that's going in. Now, an interesting feature on ROSTOCK is the loop feature. Here you can see that in action. So right now I looped 8 stages, and again the length of these stages are determined by the rate of the clock, so the sample rate. If I slow down the sample rate, we're still getting 8 stages, but of course the signal won't be as high fidelity. You can loop more stages if you want. And if you then play around with sample rate, you will see that, well, because these stages, well, the length of them is determined by the sample rate, even though you're not taking in new information into the buffer or into the loop, you can still adjust the length of the stages, which causes us to create these subharmonics. And by this point you can just remove the signal that's going in. So just as a reminder, this here, when I'm turning this, I'm just adjusting the sample rate, so the clock that's going into Dresno here. So at some settings, you won't actually see or hear any difference between the regular delayed sound and when I start looping it. And this is probably because the clock rate and the amount of steps is, well, set precisely, so we're getting an even, well, a complete amount of cycles. Of course, when you now start shortening the amount of cycles, you will again change your shape and your frequency. And when you're turning them down like I just did, the loop is just truncated. And then when you increase the loop again, well, it just keeps on looping what's in the loop. Since there's a lot of information that's just been dumped, you will get a different result. It's not like you can go down and then expect to, when you go up again, end up with the same loop that you started off with. So that's the loop function. You can activate this by sending in CV. Let's use another one of these VCOs. Let's just take the square output. So right now this is behaving as a square LFO. Let's run this into the loop. CV input. And let's make the loop shorter, because right now you're not hearing that it's being looped. Now this is really sounding like an ambulance. So let's turn down the sample rate to something arbitrary. Let's slow down this LFO. Let's increase the sample rate. So once again, we're at a setting where the loop is equal to a certain number of cycles. So we're not hearing any changes. But what you then can do is introduce the scramble feature, which when activated looks at both the information that's in the buffer that's looping, and it looks at the information that's coming in. It compares these binary numbers because, well, it's still all in binary as long as it's inside the system here. It compares each bit in an XOR logic comparison, and the end result of that comparison will be used as new information in the buffer. Now keep in mind, when I press this, the changes happen at the start of the buffer, so it takes 19 clock pulses, 19 stages for this new information to reach the end of, well, the conveyor belt. So it takes a while until we hear it. At these speeds, of course, this is rather immediate. At the end of the video, I'm showing you the Turing Machine patch. There you will notice that it takes a while for the new information to reach the end, because then we're using a really slow clock. But as you can see and hear, pressing this scramble button here changes the sound drastically. And you can also use an LFO or, well, whatever gate signal you have to activate this feature. Now if you end up with something you like inside the buffer, well, there's a way to make this behave like an oscillator that's dragging pitch when you start sequencing the oscillator that's being used as a clock source. So that's this left oscillator here. Let me run a sequence into it. And this way you can kind of mimic a custom PCO. So maybe you would like to randomize this. Well, let's take the gate output of my sequencer. I'm using Moskva 2, by the way, for this. So let's take this gate signal and run it into the scramble. I have the Ostankino expander, so I can just use the clock out to trigger the scramble feature. Or I can use one of these bit outputs on Ostankino. Which means that every once in a while information in the buffer is being changed. So as you can hear, this is a really cool way to, well, change up the sound sources in your system. And by the way, pressing clear will clear the buffer. So as soon as you press this, the buffer is cleared, but it starts looking at new information immediately. So when loop is activated and you press clear, there's no new information being let into the loop, so the buffer stays empty. But when you disengage the loop, you press clear, the buffer is being emptied, but once again it starts looking at new information immediately, and it will take, in this case, 32 clock pulses, because there's 32 stages of delay active. It will take that amount of the time it represents for the new signal to reach the end of the conveyor belt. And you can see this is almost immediate. Let me slow down my clock source. Let's move this. If I increase the amount of stages, you will actually be able to hear a short moment of silence there. Well, this doesn't make a lot of sense when the system is running at these high rates, but it will make sense once you start running slower sequences through the system, which I will get to by the end of the video. So let's head over to the next segment of the video. In the manual of ROSTOCK, there's a few patch ideas, and as I mentioned before, I want to run through them together. I'll figure out how to call those patch ideas, and I'll put it on screen right now. But this first one is really similar, or well, identical to what we have been doing all the time. And this is just audio rate processing signals with ROSTOCK. I'll add the feedback trick in that's mentioned in the text as well. So for this patch I just made some kind of a complex VCO patch. There's some through zero linear FM and some wave folding going on, but not a lot. I want to keep the signal kind of basic, so we can hear what's going on when I start mangling it with Fresno and ROSTOCK. Right now I'm just using the built-in clock of the LEIBNIZ system, which is running at 2 MHz. And when I bring in the original signal, because, well, you can see these stackable cables here, I've melted the original signal to send it into the Fresno ROSTOCK combination, and to send it separately to my mixer as well. So this is the dry signal. You can hear there's not a lot of difference there. So mixed together it sounds like this. Of course that's a lot louder, so let's bring down the levels a little bit. Not too much. Just as before, we're not getting a lot of delay because we're using the built-in clock. So I want to add my own clock again, and once again I'm zooming out, not to really show you the wave shapes, but just to give you some kind of idea what's going on. So I made 3 clocks, but let's just first ignore these 2 other ones. You can probably guess what I will do with these, but let's just send in an audio rate clock. Once again I'm using a square output of 3 body, and with that running there's a little bit of a delay. I figured out my own way of doing the feedback routing that's mentioned in the manual. So when I turn up this knob, I'm introducing feedback. And when you tune the rate or the frequency of your clock source just right, you can get these sharpless strong resonances, which I really like. I'll explain the routing very quickly. And for this feedback patching, I'm using my main mixer, and I added one utility mixer, this one here. So I'm sending in my original signal into one input of this utility mixer. I have this on the first input here. When I turn it down, you can still hear the original signal because I've multed it here to go to my main mixer. But you can no longer hear it going through Dresno and Rostock. And this should make it clear that I'm using the output of this mixer to send into Dresno and Rostock. And then I used this stackable to send the output of Dresno and Rostock into my main mixer as well. So that's how the signal gets to our ears. But of course I also want to be able to send the output of the delay line back into itself. So to do that I use this multed signal here, and I've sent it back to an input on the mixer. For this I'm using the second input. And when I turn this up, you get these delay feedbacks. Of course, when you now start playing around with the speed of your clock, the sample rate at which everything is getting converted into binary is going down, but at the same time our delay times are going up. So with no feedback, that sounds like this, and with feedback, well, you get these typical delay feedback lines. Let's turn it way into well, the highest it can go. I wanted to say let's turn it into audio rates, but it's already in audio rates. Let's bring down the feedback and let's unmute these two other VCOs here that I'm showing on data. So one, the red one, is another output of 3 body. This is also a square wave, but it's going 2 times as slow. I know it's really difficult to make out from the tiny image, but just know that the cable that I'm about to connect is a clock. That's a divide by 2 of the clock that I'm using for the whole system here. And by whole system I mean the Leibniz subsystem. So let me just patch this slower clock into an arbitrary clock input of ROSTOCK. And at bit 4 we can't hear much of a difference. The lower you go, the least significant the bits become, and well, of course, the less of an influence this is going to have. So let's go straight for the 8-bit. And of course, this starts distorting our signal because the binary number is getting changed up. I have another clock here that's even running at a lower division, or should I say higher division. It's running slower. Let's patch that into a bit here as well. And if I now turn up my envelopes a bit, either way this sounds lovely, at least to my ears. Let's play around with these clocks. So this is with just one audio rate clock going into Dresno, without the divided clocks. Let's patch them back in. Let's make them even slower. And let's change up where they are going. And I'm clipping my mixer here. And it shouldn't be a surprise that as soon as you start changing the bits or the bytes, you'll just get something that sounds as distortion. So don't expect to get crazy musical results out of this. I'm sure you could if you really start doing maths. Let's just turn a few more knobs. And I just now realized that the top of my utility mixer is off screen, so let me try to turn my camera a bit. I'm just hoping everything is still a bit in focus. If it's not in focus, then welcome to my increasingly blurry world. Let's play around with the frequency of the global clock. I want to try and find those resonant frequencies again. Oh well, there they are. Let's patch up some less significant bits. And then I can still do what I showed you before, that's modulating the frequency of our clock source. And as I have set it up right here, I'm actually modulating the frequency of all three the clock sources that I'm using, because these two clocks here are being derived from the clock I'm using as a global clock here. Let's bring in some frequency modulation for the clocks. There's nothing stopping you from bringing the frequency modulation of your clock into audio rates as well. And all of this sounds like a lovely mess. That being said, you don't need ROSTOCK to make this kind of ruckus with the LEIBNIZ system. So let's reorganize this part of my case here for the next patch idea. So just like the manual suggested, for this patch I connected the LEIBNIZ output of ROSTOCK, so that's the connectors on the back. You use these kind of ribbon cables to connect those, by the way. So I connected the output of ROSTOCK to the LEIBNIZ input on JENA and vice versa. And depending on which bank and which settings JENA is on, this creates this kind of feedback loop where JENA sends out some kind of binary number. This gets delayed by ROSTOCK, which sends it back into JENA, etc. I don't think, well, yes it does. The link button engages JENA being in the circuit. At first I thought I had done something wrong, but this is just because, well, in a lot of settings there's nothing really happening, or at least not noticeable. But I just wanted to do this, and as you can see, sometimes it starts looping or it starts going for a while and then it stops. This will probably be because of the lookup tables in JENA. Receiving is 0 and also transmitting is 0. But well, as you can see, you can find these interesting feedback loops. Now for now, this is just flashing away. So with JENA, of course, we have access to these separate bit outputs. Let me power up the second half of my case. You're not going to be able to see this, but I'm just connecting a few drum modules just to demonstrate that this is indeed working. Let's go for tambourine. You can never have enough tambourines. Not so sure about cowbells though. And as you can see, this kind of behaves rather chaotically, which is also what's suggested in the manual. So if you have the patience to set this up, you can make it work. Let's remove these drums. Now I want to try and use Dresno. So Dresno is not connected to anything on the back. Well, it's connected to the power rail, but that's it. It's also not connected to itself, so pressing the link button won't route the input stage to the output stage. What I'm going to do is just connect all these, well, the bit outputs of JENA to the bit inputs of the DAC part of Dresno. This should enable me to use the analog output of Dresno, for example, to sequence Odessa. That's what I'm going to try and show. So there we are. I figured this out earlier, but well, it might be puzzling to you why there's nothing happening here. I can connect this LED cable and you will see that, well, there's nothing going on at all. It's almost like Dresno's output stage is dead. But in fact it is not. You just have to send in a clock to the DAC because there's nothing in terms of clock there. So as soon as I connect a clock, you can see that right now Dresno is starting to convert whatever Jena is doing together with ROSTOCK into an analog signal. And I want to use this, as I said, to sequence Odessa. This will probably not sound musical at all, but I think it's a good way to demonstrate the sort of sequences that you can get out of this kind of chaotic patch idea. Let's scale this a bit with the gain slider on Dresno. Let's bring in some reverb for this. That's a lot better. Maybe some delay, why not? So, as you can see, and well, most of all here, even though what I was thinking the whole time a bit earlier, when the LEDs go into a state like this, I thought nothing was happening, but in fact there is happening a lot. So that's pretty cool. What happens when I loop this? Not much, because we're listening to Jena's output. Clearing the buffer is also okay. I don't think it matters all that much what setting ROSTOCK is on. Yeah, okay. This turns out to be cooler than I initially thought. Maybe let's turn down the delay a bit so you can more clearly hear the type of sequences that you can get out of this. Now I'm using this for pitch CV, but you can use this kind of output for everything you want. And it's crazy and well also typical for a chaotic system is that small changes can yield big differences. I mean, there it goes. This is really cool to witness actually. So it goes on for a while and then it's just chaos. Well, I mean, who doesn't love chaos, right? try this with the Walsh bank. I think that's bank D. E is the drum bank, yeah. Well, there we go again. Anyway, let's move over to the next patch idea. I don't want to spend too much time on this patch because, well, I'm pretty amazed that it actually works. Well, if you just connect everything like it's described in the manual, you can get this LIPSK POCZDAM ROSTOCK trigger sequencer to work just fine. So to make this patch work, you need to connect the output header on the back of LIPSK to one of the inputs on POCZDAM. The output 2 of POCZDAM is going into ROSTOCK, and the output of ROSTOCK is going back to the input of LIPSK. So there's some kind of feedback happening or some kind of loop happening, which I don't completely understand. So I have this sequence running on Moskwa 2. Since I'm the lucky owner of an Ostankino 2 expander for Moskwa 2, I have access to the clock output of the sequencer, so let's use that to connect to the outgoing clock in. It says so in the manual that you really need to connect your own clock here. So now we have a programmable trigger or gate sequencer with 16, well, 1 to 46 steps, but currently I'm at 16. And you, well, set or program your sequencer with the buttons on LIPSK. To make things a little bit easier to follow, I've connected these first 3 white cables here to a kick drum module, a snare drum module, and a hi-hat module. And the 4th one is going into mats, which you can just see below LEIBNIZ system here. And I'm running it into the regular input on mats. And this will give us an envelope that will open and close a VCA, through which I'm running some filtered pink noise. The reason I'm doing this, and you will be able to see some kind of representation on these LEDs here that prove that, well, you can program longer gates and shorter gates. The resolution is, of course, limited by your clock. The sequence is just running as a backdrop, so we have something to listen to. So let's program a kick drum. So once again, I'm only using these 4 outputs. And by the way, these are the incoming data outputs. So these are the bit outputs for whatever's going through the system. And these correspond to the 4 rightmost buttons here. So let's program a kick. And to do this, I press to activate a gate, and then I press again to deactivate it. You'll see when I just press and leave it lit up. You can see here that we programmed a long gate. But of course, if you work with drum modules that expect triggers, programming a long gate doesn't make a lot of sense. So So I will now program a hi-hat. So you'll see me press and press again, so to make the gates as short as possible. And to demonstrate these gates, let's use the fourth sound, which is the filtered noise going through a VCA. That's being opened and closed by a slewed gate. You can clear what we did here by just pressing the clear button. And I don't know why, but for some reason, sometimes there's some residual gate. We can also do like weird length sequences. Let's choose 13 because why not? So these sequences can go up to 46 steps, so you can have a lot of variation going on. So let's maybe just try something. So that's like one beat. Let's make it 8 steps long. I guess you need to loop it. And then if we increase, that's really weird. I would expect that the pattern just, well, it's kind of duplicated, but apparently that's not the case. Anyway, let's move over to the next patch, because I could spend hours trying to find interesting rhythms with this. And this is probably because I don't have a dedicated trigger or gate sequencer in my rack at all. But yeah, this is really cool. Well, if you're in a pinch, it can really work, especially if you increase the resolution on this relative to our sequence. You can create more intricate rhythms. Of course, you really need to be able to press these fast. You could of course send in like gates. I think that beats the purpose a little bit. I have an LFO here. I send that in. I can program this stuff with that. Let's just clear this to prove the point. So let's just use this gated filtered noise. So this is like a quantized version of what went in. So let's now connect this square LFO to the kick drum. And let's choose a random speed connected to the snare. And then with quicker for the hi-hat, well, for the control that programs the hi-hat. And these outputs react to what you do here immediately. But once it's gone through ROSTOCK, it gets kind of quantized, as you can hear. Anyway, like I said, let's move over to the next patch. So for this next patch, I'm using the same setup as before. The big difference here is that I have connected the bit outputs on POCZDAM to the bit inputs. So bit output 7 goes to bit input 6, bit output 6 goes to bit input 5, etc. In a moment I will use this spare input as an audio input, and I'll use the spare output here, bit output 0, as an audio rate output, because with this patch you can do, well, a whole lot of things, but I just want to, well, give you kind of an idea of what's going on. So once again, I'm patching up my own clock. So keep in mind, ROSTOCK is connected to the second output on POCZDAM. LIPSK is still connected to the first input, but apart from doing this brief demonstration here, I won't be using LIPSK at all. But what I want to show you is that when the setup is similar to what we had before, LIPSK is selected as an input source and the link button is engaged. When I press something here, you can see that the buffer in ROSTOCK, well, the buffer for every bit starts filling up. And this is, of course, because the outputs for the bits are routed to the next bit input. But because the output of ROSTOCK is going back into LIPSK, we get this kind of weird situation. So let's unlink this. Let's clear the buffer. So now if I press one of these bits, you will see that we get this bit train. So at this point you could use any of these outputs here. Use like these stackables to extract these triggers or gates for stuff around your system. But what I want to just quickly do is do it with audio rate stuff. So I'm going to disconnect this slow clock here. Let me patch up POCZDAM's own built-in clock, which is currently set to kilohertz. I want to delay this sequence, so I'm going to take it, send it in here, And I'm going to take this last bit output here as an audio rate output. Let's increase the amount of stages in ROSTOCK. So once again, when we increase the clock rate to, well, in the kilohertz range, but to the maximum, we don't get a lot of delay. But once we start decreasing our clock rate, our fidelity goes out the window. But we get increasing longer and longer delays. And as the manual suggests, you can patch up any of these outputs with splitter cables. So I will use another one of these stackables to also route through to my mixer, just to demonstrate that you can have kind of a, well, low fidelity, a 1-bit multi-tap delay. But as I showed you a few minutes ago, you can do this with well, sub-audio rate stuff, triggers, gates, for automating events around your system in interesting and unexpected ways. Let's briefly go into the hertz range. I mean, this is really, really nice. I don't know if this can be still called a delay effect, but very cool. I want to show you how you can make kind of a Turing machine with Dresno and ROSTOCK. And I want to patch this up together, as it will give you additional insight in how Dresno works, while getting to know another aspect of ROSTOCK. What you are hearing right now is just 3 outputs of Odessa. I patched up some feedback on the module itself, but I will not bring this in for a while. First, I want to make a random sequence, and when you've watched the video about Dresno, you already know that you can use it as a binary sample and hold. This is some pink noise. It's way too loud, so let's run it through an attenuator first. When I patch it into data, you can see the stream of random noise there. Now, when I patch this noise through data into the ADC input of Dresno, and then when we monitor the DAC output of Dresno, you can see, apart from the output being scaled a little bit, you can see that this is really very much identical. So this is what happens when you sample an analog signal in 8-bit at 2 megahertz. Of course, this isn't nowhere near sample and hold or Turing machine, but we'll get there. The problem here is exactly that the clock is way too fast. So I'll turn down this kick a little bit, because really it just acts as a reference for what the tempo of our patch will be. So to create a slower sample and hold or stepped random wave, you need to send in a slower clock, and only on those clock pulses will Dresno convert the analog signal into binary and then back into an analog signal. There's a separate input, by the way, for connecting a clock for the DAC side of Dresno. But let's just use the ADC clock. So I pulled out my LED cables again, so you can see the tempo of the clock there, and you should also be able to see that the stepped signal that we are now getting out of Dresno is following that clock. But you can also see it by watching these LEDs, which monitor the binary side of the input on Dresno. And I want to use this signal as a volt per octave source for Odessa. And at first glance, ROSTOCK doesn't really seem to do anything in this kind of patch, but in fact it is delaying our sequence with 4 stages of delay. And as I explained before, the length of these stages is determined by the speed or frequency of the clock. So right now 4 stages represent 4 flashes of this LED cable here. And you can clearly notice this when I press the clear button, which clears the buffer of ROSTOCK completely. And then it starts to, well, I want to say absorb, it's not really an accurate way of describing it. When you clear this, it's like clearing the conveyor belts in ROSTOCK. And it takes 4 stages, when we set this to 4, for the new stored information to reach the end of the conveyor belts. So you'll hear when I press this, it will take 4 steps before there's any sequence coming out of Dresno again. I'll count this 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's switch this to 8. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now without my cringy counting, so there you can see how ROSTOCK delays our slow signal. And now when you press the loop button or send a gate into the loop CV input, ROSTOCK will just keep looping its internal buffer, which is now 8 stages long. When you press it again, it just looks at the new information that's coming into the buffers. So let's set this to 6, just because I like a 6-step sequence on a 4 to the floor backbeat. Now when I press clear, nothing is happening, because in essence, when the loop is active, the buffers do not store any new information. They do not look at what's coming inside of ROSTOCK. It's just looking at what's already there. And when we clear the buffer, clearly there's nothing there. So there's nothing for ROSTOCK to loop. So once again, we made a 6-step loop. Now let's have a look at the scramble function. What scramble does, well, at least when you press down this button or send a gate into the scramble CV input, ROSTOCK looks at both the binary information that's been looping, but it also looks at what is coming in. And it compares these with XOR logic. And whatever the outcome of that comparison is, this will be the new information that ROSTOCK sends out. And well, from that point, that new information is part of the loop. So when you press this briefly, and then you depress it again, you change up your loop. Now, as soon as you have a loop going, you can start kind of modulating the scramble function with, for example, an output of ADC part of Dresno. Of course, when scramble is activated often enough, everything starts sounding a bit random anyway. But I think you get the idea. Just as before, we can increase or decrease the number of stages with this knob. So you could have a 46 stage loop. Now I think this is a really nice loop here. Now I want to introduce some feedback just with Odessa. Let's tune Odessa down a bit. Bring up the volume a bit. And since these bit outputs of Dresno just keep spitting out whatever Dresno is analyzing, so the pink noise in this case, And by the way, while the output of ROSTOCK, and because we are extracting it from the output of Dresno, that part of the system is now looping. This does not mean that you cannot use these inputs. These are not looping, and you can see it from the activity on the LEDs here. This is just as random as before. So you can use these to reintroduce some kind of randomness to your sequence. Well, not to your sequence, but to your patch. So let's just use some of these bit outputs to modulate parameters on Odessa. I have a few cables here so I can patch up a bit more. Let's try tension as well. And maybe another one for the tilt parameter, but let's turn it down a bit first because it can get quite harsh. Apparently it doesn't matter. It's harsh anyway. Well, and there's more. Let's just patch all of them into Odessa some way or other. And what's left here? The partials. That's not very exciting. Let's just try the spread. Well, I think that's fairly nice. That being said, this is going to be it for this video about ROSTOCK. It's a lot longer than I anticipated, but well, that seems to be the case for most of my videos lately. Once again, thanks to the people at Xaoc Devices and especially Lucas. And to you, thank you for watching. I really hope you learned something, and see you next time. Bye!